The Older Religiousness in the South by Richard M. Weaver. Of the many factors which have conspired to make the Southern people a distinct cultural group, so that it remains possible today to speak of the mind of the South, none has received so little informative discussion as their peculiar religious temper. The liberal journals satirize the Bible Belt and attack fundamentalism, which they identify with ignorance and general wrong-headedness, and the sociological writers, always chary of anything implying a metaphysic, handle it gingerly, if at all. Yet this religious temper is definitely a survival whose history can be traced as successfully as that of the feudal system or the tradition of chivalry. The conservative section of the country has clung to the old-time religion. It is the purpose of this paper to indicate some of the antecedents of that religion in our common heritage. It is plain that just as there was much in the economic and social structure of the Old South to suggest Europe before the Great Plague and the peasant rebellions, so there was much in its religious attitude to recall the period before the Reformation. For although the South was heavily Protestant, its attitude toward religion was essentially the attitude of orthodoxy. It was a simple acceptance of a body of belief, an innocence of protest and schism by which religion was left one of the unquestioned and unquestionable supports of the general settlement under which men live. One might press the matter further and say that it was a doctrinal innocence, for the average Southerner knew little and probably cared less about casuistical theology. What he recognized was the acknowledgement, the submissiveness of the will, and that general respect for order, natural and institutional, which is piety. In short, there was a religious as well as a political solid South, as Bishop Poteet has pointed out. Such disputes as occurred among churchmen were ecclesiastical rather than theological, saving a few striking exceptions, and the laymen themselves preferred not to regard religion as a matter for discussion. Religion was a matter for profession, and after one had professed, he became a member of a religious brotherhood. But this did not obligate him to examine the foundations of belief or to assail the professions of others. The Southerner did not want a reasoned belief, but a satisfying dogma, and the innumerable divisions which occurred on the southern and western frontiers must be ascribed to a religious intensity together with an absence of discipline rather than to a desire to effect a philosophic synthesis, as was elsewhere the case. In 1817, the Western Gazetteer and Immigrants' Directory reported of the condition of religion in Kentucky. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Seceders are the prevailing sects. They manifest a spirit of harmony and liberality toward each other, and whatever may have been said to the contrary, it is a solemn truth that religion is nowhere more respected than in Kentucky. Throughout the South and West, there occurred the anomalous condition of an incredible flowering of sects, together with the more primitive type of emotional response to religion. Travelers expressed a double amazement at the multiplicity of sects and at the lack of friction or ill will between them. This curious circumstance is susceptible of explanation. The religious solid South expressed itself in a determination to preserve for religion the character of divine revelation. Superficially, the difference between a backwoods convert and his extraordinary camp meeting exhibitionism and the restrained and mannered Episcopalian of a seaboard congregation seems very great. Yet it must be borne in mind that despite the different ways they chose to assert religious feeling, Both were inimical to the spirit of rationalism. And if the spirit of rationalism is looked upon as the foe of religion, then it must be admitted that Orthodox Christianity was as safe in the hands of one as the other. New England, on the contrary, was settled in the early years largely by people who had been embroiled in religious feuds, which they found occasion for renewing after they had set themselves up in the New World. The doctrinal differences which resulted in the exiling of Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, in the withdrawal of Thomas Hooker from the Bay Colony, and which later cost Jonathan Edwards and Ralph Waldo Emerson their pulpits, are instructive cases in point. Such troubles arise only when egotistical and self-willed people make assent a matter of intellectual conviction. In New England, the forces of dissent finally won the day. The right to criticize and even to reject the dogmas of Christianity came at length to overshadow the will to believe them, so greatly did the tide run against the conformists. And in the 19th century, Emerson, Channing, and Transcendentalism killed insistence upon uniformity in this once most orthodox of sections. A conclusion to be drawn from these events is that New England, acting out of that intellectual pride which has always characterized her people, allowed religion to become primarily a matter for analysis and debate. If we take here the point of view of the conservative religionist, instead of insisting upon a simple grammar of assent, which a proper regard for the mysteries would dictate, they conceived it their duty to explore principles, and when they had completed the exploration, they came out not with a secured faith, but with an ethical philosophy, which illuminated much, but which had none of the binding power of the older creed. There followed as characteristic results Unitarianism and Christian Science, two intellectual substitutes for a more rigorous religious faith. While this was going on, Southern churchmen were fiercely assailing the Arian heresy in New England, and were declaring that when man uses reason to test Scripture, the inevitable logical result is atheism. The results of the divergence did not appear at the beginning, for originally both Virginia and the New England colonies conceived religion as a part of the general program of government. The instructions drawn up in 1606 for the Virginia Company required that the true word and service of God be preached, planted, and used. And further provision for conformity was made by the divine and martial laws of 1611, which required that everyone who then resided in Virginia, or who should thereafter arrive, should make profession of religious belief, and if found deficient, should repair to a minister for instruction. The First General Assembly, moreover, passed a law ordaining universal church attendance. This, together with various laws against profanation and the sins of the flesh, was enforced with regularity and some severity. Virginia Episcopalians and New England dissenters thus began pari passu the suppression of what they considered alien and subversive views. As time went on, however, their paths separated. The religiousness, which in Virginia had originally been supported by laws, remained as a crystallized popular sentiment. In New England, always more responsive to impulses from abroad, it weakened and virtually disappeared. New Englanders cultivated metaphysics and sharp speculation. Southerners, generally, having saved their faith, as they thought, from the whole group of priors, reformers, and troublesome messiahs, settled back and regarded it as part of their inheritance, which they did not propose to have disturbed. Such religious persecution as occurred in Virginia found its victims not among heretics in theology, but among actual or potential disturbers of the peace. The Quakers, who were considered the foremost of these, were treated with extreme hostility throughout the 17th century. The charge leveled against these zealots was not that of doctrinal heresy, it was that their principles tended to undermine the whole institutional character of religion, and the state as well. They would not contribute to the support of the established church, they did not hold public assemblies, and they would not bear arms in defense of the commonwealth. It is little wonder that to colonial administrators, these evidences savored of disaffection to the point of disloyalty, and that Quakers were commonly described as a pestilential sect and an unruly and turbulent sort of people. The General Assembly of Virginia in the winter of 1659 to 1660 declared that their beliefs tended to destroy religion, laws, communities, and all bonds of civil society, and passed laws forbidding the immigration of Quakers and banishing those already in the colony. They were being punished not for the sin of theological schism, but for the sin of political non-cooperation. And although these are not necessarily unrelated, the happier fate of other sects within the state suggests that the authorities were indifferent to doctrine, which had only theological implications. The history of Unitarianism in the South provides a further commentary on the Southern conception of the role of religion. While the Puritan was attempting to make his religion conform to the canons of logic, conscience, or ethical propriety, the Southerner clung stubbornly to the belief that a certain portion of life must remain inscrutable, that religion offers our only means of meeting it, and that reason cannot here be a standard of interpretation. Unitarianism, as a conspicuously speculative kind of divinity, was agreeable to those who test belief by reason, but unattractive to those who long for a sustaining creed and a means of emotional fulfillment. Captain Basil Hall, in his Travels in North America in the years 1827 and 1828, gives an amusing account of a Unitarian preacher whom he heard in Boston. He then embarked on the great ocean of religious controversy, but with such consummate skill that we scarcely knew we were at sea till we discovered that no land was in sight. It must be confessed that in the South there were few congregations of a sufficiently intellectual disposition to enjoy this kind of voyaging. Philip Francis J. Grund wrote, "The inhabitants of the South are principally Episcopalians, and as much attached to authority in religion as they are opposed to it in politics. They consider Unitarianism as a religious democracy, because it relies less on the authority of the Scriptures than on the manner in which the authority of the clergy expounds them, and retains too little mysticism in its form of worship to strike the multitude with awe." And James Freeman Clarke found that in Kentucky, the nature of the people demanded a more emotional discourse than the typical Unitarian sermon provided. A fairly intensive missionary effort succeeded in establishing Unitarian societies in Baltimore, Augusta, Savannah, Mobile, New Orleans, Nashville, Louisville, and a few other cities, but most of these dwindled after a brief period of flourishing. As it became plain that religious radicalism in New England was tending toward anarchy, and more especially as radical clergymen became prominently identified with abolitionism, Southern religious orthodoxy hardened, and the Unitarian societies became powerless to propagate themselves. General evidence that the South afforded poor soil for religious radicalism may be further seen in the following distribution of churches. In 1860, this section had one of the 51 Swedenborgian churches in the United States, 20 of the 664 Universalist, and none of the 17 Spiritualist. In his autobiography, Peter Cartwright rejoiced that during the Great Revival, universalism was almost driven from the land. Among all classes in the South, an opinion obtained that religion should be a sentiment. Where the people were refined, the sentiment was refined. Where they were demonstrative and disorderly, it was likely to be such. Among the aristocratic congregations of seaboard communities, overt expression was at a minimum. The apathy with which such a cultivated congregation regarded its faith and the labors of its ministry may be illustrated through a story reported by Harriet Martineau. A Southern clergyman mentioned to me, obviously with difficulty and pain, that though he was as happily placed as a minister could be, treated with friendliness and generosity by his people, and so cherished as to show that they were satisfied, he had one trouble. During all the years of his ministry, no token had reached him that he had religiously impressed their minds, more or less. They met regularly and decorously on Sundays, and departed quietly, and there was an end. He did not know that any one discourse had affected them more than another, and no opportunity was offered him of witnessing any religious emotion among them whatever. A tradition of gentility and a belief that the content of religion was settled combined to produce this condition. All agitation was frowned upon. Restless and skeptical minds, who would dispute the grounds of the canon, were looked upon as persons inimical to a comfortable and orderly design for living. Refuting a point of doctrine brought one a reputation not so much for intellectual distinction as for perverseness and ill will. Because of her zeal for inquiry, New England was contemptuously referred to as the land of notions. A writer in the Southern Literary Messenger, drawing a contrast between Southern and Northern people, found the latter lacking in a sense of measure. Having liberty which they do not appreciate, they run into anarchy. Being devotional, they push their piety to the extremes of fanaticism. Being contentious withal, they are led to attack the interests of others merely because those interests do not comport with their ideas of right. What the Southerner desired above all else in religion was a fine set of images to contemplate, as Allen Tate has shown in his Religion and the Old South. The contemplation of these images was in itself a discipline and virtue, which had the effect of building up in him an inner restraint, and thus a sense of restraint and a willingness to abide by the tradition were universally viewed as marks of the gentleman. On the other hand, the spirit of discontent, of aggressiveness, and of inquisitiveness was associated with those who had something to gain by overturning the established order. In consequence, it is not difficult to see why the Southern gentleman looked upon religion as a great conservative agent and a bulwark of those institutions which served him. Spokesmen of the South were constantly criticizing Northerners for making religion a handmaid of social and political reform. A critic of Dr. Channing, writing in the Southern Quarterly Review, declared, "It is not very usual for the clergy of our country to enter with zeal upon the arena of politics. The department of a religious teacher is supposed to lie in a different sphere and to embrace different duties, and the people generally listen to him with aversion and reluctance when he meddles with secular subjects." Some years later, a writer in the Southern Literary Messenger thus described the North's mixing of religion and secular causes. Her priesthood prostitutes itself to the level with a blackguard, and enters the secular field of politics in the spirit of a beer-house bully, and the politician as carelessly invades the sanctuary of the priest. Although Southern clergymen occasionally invoked the Word of God to defend Southern institutions, especially when these were being assailed, As a general rule, they were overwhelmingly opposed to the use of the church as a tool for secular reform. The evangelical sects aimed at a conversion of the inner man, the conservative ones at the exposition of a revealed ethic, but both regarded themselves as custodians of the mysteries, little concerned with social agitation and out of the reach of winds of political doctrine. Reverence for the Word of God has been a highly important aspect of Southern religious orthodoxy. Modern discussions of fundamentalism have overlooked the fact that belief in revealed knowledge is the essence of religion in its older sense, so that this point perhaps needs special emphasis. The necessity of having some form of knowledge which will stand above the welter of earthly change and bear witness that God is superior to accident led Thomas Aquinas to establish his famous dichotomy, which says, briefly, that whereas some things may be learned through investigation and the exercise of the reasoning powers, others must be given or revealed by God. Man cannot live under a settled dispensation if the postulates of his existence must be continually revised in accordance with knowledge furnished by a nature filled with contingencies. Nature is a vast unknown. In the science of nature, there are constantly appearing emergents which, if allowed to affect spiritual and moral verities, would destroy them by rendering them dubious, tentative, and conflicting. It is therefore imperative in the eyes of the older religionists that man have for guidance in this life a body of knowledge to which the facts of natural discovery are either subordinate or irrelevant. This body is the rock of ages, firm in the vast sea of human passion and error. Moral truth is not something which can be altered every time science widens its field of induction. If moral philosophy must wait upon natural philosophy, all moral judgments become temporary, relative, and lacking in those sanctions which alone makes them effective. And though probably no people were more ignorant of the Summa Theologica than the inarticulate and little-read rural Southern population, this Thomistic dualism lies implicit in their opposition to scientific monism, the most persistent of the South's medieval heritages. Then, as now, it explains their dogged adherence to what is taught in the book, and their indifference to empirical disproofs. Emerson and his colleagues founded their revolt against New England orthodoxy on the principle of the continuity of knowledge and the prerogative of the individual mind to judge and determine. They were successful, and the country concluded that the victory was won everywhere. But in the South, the battle has not yet been fought. In the present century, when publicity attending the theory of evolution forced the issue, there was widespread amazement that legislatures representing sovereign states were prepared to vote revealed knowledge precedence over natural, for such, in a broad way of viewing the matter, is the significance of the anti-evolution laws. This could not have surprised anyone who knew the tradition, for in the South there had never been any impeachment of the Word, and science had not usurped the seats of the prophets. It may therefore be proper to describe the South as backward if one employs the word not in a vaguely prejudicial sense, but with some reference to the continuum of history. The South was striving to preserve a century-old distinction which the North was condemning as error. Indeed, it has been a settled practice with Southern spokesmen to describe the differences between North and South in religious language. When the period of sectional separation came, more than one Southern churchman could be found placing the blame for the sins of New England. the most notable of which was abolitionism, upon the great Socinian heresy. This was an open attack upon the whole movement of deism and rationalism, which, by the middle of the 18th century, had captured the cultivated orders of Europe, and by the middle of the next, much of New England and the North. In the midst of the Gilded Age, the Reverend R.L. Dabney, a celebrated Presbyterian divine, pronounced pragmatism the equivalent of atheism, and fundamentalist leaders today regard the purely scientific view of man as only the modern pose of godlessness. It cannot be denied that during the period of the French Revolution, there was much religious skepticism in certain Southern educational centers and among elements of the Southern upper class. It was, however, a transient phase, confined while it lasted to small cultivated groups, and it disappeared so completely in the antebellum years that it can be properly ignored in any account of the molding of the Confederate South. Skepticism is always an achievement of an intellectual aristocracy, who by education and through access to libraries become accustomed to the critical handling of ideas. At the close of the 18th century, and for perhaps 2 decades afterwards, some Southern aristocrats considered it fashionable to embrace deism and to flaunt a disrespect for the Bible. Jefferson, who in this period translated 20 chapters of Volney's Ruins, is, of course, the best-known Southern exponent of free thinking. The irreligion of the day turned Williamsburg, home of Venerable William and Mary College, into a veritable seat of infidelity. It flourished surprisingly at the University of North Carolina. It crept across the mountains and infected illustrious Transylvania in the bluegrass region of Kentucky, shocking Amos Kendall by the extent of its prevalence, and it penetrated the University of Georgia, then in its early years. It remained, however, distinctly an upper-class attitude, sharply localized and without power to affect the essential religiousness of the Southern populace. After 1830, when the South, as if by prescience, turned to a defense of all conservative ideals, it declined almost to the point of extinction. One might suppose that the powerful example of Jefferson would have started a school of rationalism below the Potomac. But in this matter, as in others, Jefferson failed to take root in his section. His doctrine of states' rights and his agrarianism were cherished, but his religious liberalism, like most else that he learned from the French radicals, was ignored. His influence waned so rapidly that within a few years after his death, the Presbyterians were able to force the resignation of an atheist professor from the University of Virginia, which he had aspired to make the very citadel of unfettered thought. In the same period, South Carolina fundamentalists compelled the removal of President Cooper of the State University because he had questioned the authority of the Pentateuch. Some notice must be taken of the influence of 19th century science upon the religious temper of the Old South. It has been a common assumption that Southerners devoted their minds to politics, the classics, and the novels of Sir Walter Scott, remaining blandly innocent of the discoveries in which this century was so fruitful. Like other generalized conceptions, this one is broadly true, but omits much which would qualify the picture. Thomas Carey Johnson, in a survey of scientific interests in the antebellum South, has corrected many overstatements of Southern indifference to the spirit of the age. He found natural science taught not only in colleges, where it sometimes led the list of elective subjects, but even in female seminaries, and he names a number of Southerners who proved themselves fertile in theory and invention. His study, however, affords little, if any, evidence that this scientific interest, more widespread than is popularly supposed, issued in a skeptical habit of mind. The truth seems clear that the Southern scientist did not carry his scientific speculation to the point at which it becomes an interpretation of the whole of life. Mr. Johnson ascribes the failure of the South to become immanent in scientific thought to the individualism of its people and their unwillingness to cooperate in common enterprises. But it appears nearer the truth to say that the traditional mind of the South, although it recognized in science a fascinating technology, refused to become absorbed in it to the extent of making it either a philosophy of life or a religion. It thus clung to its inherited religious humanism. Unlike the technician, the average Southerner did not feel that he must do a thing because he found that he could do it. It is highly significant that neither the Jacobinism of the French Revolution nor the scientific materialism of the century which followed was able to draw him from the view that man holds a central position in the universe under divine guidance. So the Southern people reached the eve of the Civil War one of the few religious peoples left in the Western world. Into the strange personnel of the Confederate Army, out of regions that sat in darkness, poured fighting bishops and prayer-holding generals, and through it swept waves of intense religious enthusiasm long lost to history. It is on record that there were more than 15,000 conversions in the Army of Northern Virginia alone. And when that army went down in defeat, the last barrier to the secular spirit of science, materialism, and pragmatism was swept away. It seems an inescapable inference that in the sphere of religion, the Southerner has always been hostile to the spirit of inquiry. He felt that a religion which is intellectual only is no religion. His was a natural piety expressing itself in uncritical belief and in the experience of conversion, not in an ambition to perfect a system or to tidy up a world doomed to remain forever deceptive, changeful, and evil. For him, a moral science made up of postulates and deductions, and taking no cognizance of the inscrutable designs of Providence and the ineluctable tragedies of private lives, was no substitute. Whether he was a Virginia Episcopalian, dozing in comfortable dogmatic slumber, or a Celt transplanted to the Appalachian wilderness, and responding to the intense emotionalism of the religious rally, he wanted the older religion of dreams and drunkenness, something akin to the rituals of the medieval church, and to the Eleusinian mysteries of the ancients.